Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to our Data Lit podcast. For the past couple of episodes, we've been focusing on types of assessments, and we've shared so far that there are basically two assessment camps. We have assessments of learning, and then we have the assessments for learning. And one of the purposes of assessments is to sort of measure learning. And this way of classifying assessments, to me, has to do with timing. As a teacher, you're always thinking about what's a good time to check in with students to see where they are with regards to their learning targets. And so in this episode, we're going to look at the assessments for learning. Serena covered in her last episodes the of, and in this one, we're going to look at the for. So when we think of the assessments for learning, typically we're thinking of our formative assessments, right? That's the most common example of assessments for learning. So for me, an analogy that comes to mind is I like to think of the assessments for learning as a dress rehearsal, right? It's when you're practicing to see, you have a big performance, and it's the thing that you can do to sort of get ready for that big final hurrah. So Spencer and Serena, what is an analogy that comes to mind when you think of assessment for learning?
So one that I like, you'll hear from time to time, is the cook analogy. So actually, yesterday I was making like a bolognese sauce, for spaghetti marinara with some meat on it. And essentially, I'm cooking it all day on the slow cooker. So the beginning of the day, I put in the ground turkey, the tomato paste, tomato sauce, some seasoning, those kind of things. And then, midday, I'll kind of taste it and say like, needs more salt or needs some more basil leaves, whatever it might be. Right. And that moment there is kind of that assessment for learning. Like I'm the only one kind of checking in and seeing like how this is working. At the end of the day, when I give it to Ashley and my kids, that's kind of the assessment of learning. When Eva, my toddler, says, no, I want chicken nuggets instead. Like that's the assessment of learning. But me checking in at like midday, that's kind of to me the assessment for learning.
Right. Serena.
Spencer making me hungry here. But when I think of assessment for learning, I'm going to go back to my initial thought when I mentioned the journey. And so I'm thinking of assessment for learning in terms of, you start planning out all the different things that you want to see along the way. You know that there are going to be some major milestones along that journey, but for the assessment of learning, there are some little things that you're going to want to stop and check and see, but you're not going to spend a long time doing that. You're going to, like some sightseeing along the way, but you're going to make sure that you put that down in your planning, your trip. And you're going to check in on that. And you can cross it off as you go along. You're just checking and crossing off. I did see this. I did see that. So that's what I think of when I think of assessment for learning.
Great. So I think for our listeners, the big difference between them is one allows for more changes and one that has a little bit more finality to it. So when we define assessments for learning, again, it is the processes that you put in place that allows for adjustments. So the definition for formative assessment that I typically use is one that comes from the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSO, and they describe it as its planned, ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching to elicit and use evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of intended disciplinary learning outcomes and supports to help students become self-directed learners. I like that definition. I know it's long to take in, but the reason why I like it is because when you think of all of the researchers that are out there, right, like Dylan Williams and Sue Brookhart and some of the others, when they talk about all of the aspects or the stages of formative assessment, I felt as though, and this definition has changed over the years, they try to encompass all of the key components of formative assessment process into that definition, right? So it has about the journey, it has about its ongoing, it has about that planning piece, it has the student involvement piece, it has all of the different aspects that makes formative assessment as a process what it really is. So as I think of formative assessment, it's one of those things where in my head, I had to sort of think of it as a two-part. It is formative assessment, the verb, right, with that process piece about how you do assessments, and then there's formative assessment as a noun. And when you think of formative assessment as a verb, again, you have that processes, right? So it starts off with, are you clarifying learning goals? That's really big. We're always good on clarifying the learning targets. A piece that I want us to always remember is the success criteria. You can't just be defining the learning targets where students are supposed to go if you don't have them know what success is going to look like. When they get there, what is that going to look like? So that they can also sort of self-assess themselves, right, during the process. Another part of it, again, is engaging students, again, and not just themselves, but as peers in that feedback process. Because again, formative assessment is that time when you can allow for adjustments. So in the classroom, again, when I set up my lesson, I'm thinking, what are the things that I'm going to do to help students know what the learning targets are, know what success looks like, and then again, what are the things that I'm going to put in that allows them to sort of self-assess. So it might be a type of question that I'm using with them to sort of know, okay, I'm going to ask this question, and based on how they answer, I'm going to know, okay, am I going to go down this path, or am I going to go along that path? What about you guys in your classroom? How do you see formative assessment as a process?
So, in terms of the classroom, you mentioned something here about, we have the learning goals, but not necessarily sometimes giving the students the success criteria. What does that look like? And so, I'm just thinking back about my classroom. Year after year, I'll make my students do, like special projects. And what I try to do is save some of the good examples. Definitely, you're going to have some 1 and 2 examples that needs improvement. But I always try to save up that for the students next year, especially knowing that the curriculum standard hasn't changed. And so sometimes I display them before the start of a particular unit, or sometimes I wait until the last part, because if I'm going to give students, like, for example, my diorama for them to complete, if the students see a previous diorama, sometimes I think it might limit about what their creativity. So I give them as much as, and then sometimes I maybe just even show it to them and then tell them, they did this last year. I want to see more. I want to see a bigger, better, something along that line. So that's what that looks like, that process piece in the classroom, giving students the examples of what the success looks like when they have, completed a particular area of, the learning.
Yeah, and something that stands out to me as we talk about formative assessment as a process is that it's a process that happens not to students, but with students.
Right.
Like, to use Serena's, analogy, they're with us riding shotgun, or maybe even in the driver's seat on that journey. The metaphor falls apart a little bit because they're too young to drive, but you get the larger point. And I think that's really important and empowering. And in this podcast, I feel like we talk a lot, rightfully so, about assessments being valid and reliable. But I think to a quote by Rick Siggins in his piece, Assessment Manifesto, where he says that the most valid and reliable assessment in the world that has the effect of causing students to give up in hopelessness cannot be regarded as productive because it does far more harm than good. And I think formative assessment as a process with students can be extremely empowering. And that's something that really stands out to me as you're talking about that.
Right, because your formative assessment, right, is when you're practicing. It's that that early stage of learning where you're just trying to see, kind of get a feel of, okay, am I doing this right? Is this what you're trying to get at? Is that the target I'm trying to meet? So it's that new stage of learning. And so I think, as you said, it's really key for teachers to be intentional during that part, because again, you can make or break a child, during that stuff. If you limit their thinking, like, what, I just can't get it, then it's really hard to kind of move from that point to think, no, I am capable as a learner to learn more and change and to do something differently. So I think it's really imperative as teachers, when they're thinking of their early stages and formative assessments as a process, that early beginning piece, like what will you be putting in that part? So it helps students move their thinking forward.
And as I mentioned that, Mellisa, so when I'm thinking also as thinking of assessment for learning, I'm thinking of that's the way where the teacher gets to see where the students are in their learning, right? I'm not waiting until I'm at the end of this thing to figure out, now, where are you? No, it's that ongoing piece where I'm figuring out where you are in your learning, where you need to go. And also it's at that point I'm getting to the idea as to how best to get you there.
Right. It's that trying to figure it out before you do that final, okay, I'm ready for it to be graded and masked, I'm ready to show you this is what I know, and then to have that piece formally graded. So when we have the formative assessment as a noun, it's the techniques, right? The actual techniques that we use during the process that I sort of think about. And again, those vary depending on our purpose. Like if I think of a lesson, so that's my chunk in time, there are some formative assessments that I use at the beginning of learning, right? Because I kind of want to see, all right, what is their incoming knowledge or skill, try to prime their brain towards something. So I used to like to give like entrance tickets or pose a question and have kids go to 4 corners. Are there any activities that you guys used to think of or used in your classroom that would do that same thing at the beginning of a lesson to sort of either capture what students know or to sort of pump their learning?
So I'll be honest and say that for me, I did much better in terms of the technique for the start of learning than the end of learning. Like you have that primacy and recency effect. Like we know that those two pieces is what students are going to recall the best. And I would always lesson plan, and I would hit that kind of starter learning formative assessment. And then this part might not be surprising to listeners, but then I would talk too much or have the students talk too much and not want to cut off the conversation. And then I'd run out of time from hitting that end of learning formative assessment. I think I did a disservice to my students because that is a great way to kind of really check in. All right, what did they get from this last hour? So for me, I think of the ways in which I missed some of these opportunities to leverage the formative assessment as a noun.
And I think, like I said, teaching is a journey, and so you learn that along the way, right? I mean, I don't think any one of us is perfect in our assessments that we do, but you try to get better and better. And so again, there's sometimes, like you said, I'm ready for the beginning of the lesson, and so I have all of my assessment techniques that are really good, and they sort of fall apart as I go into the lesson because I'm trying to cover everything in terms of what techniques I use during the lesson or even at the end of the lesson. And I started when exit tickets were like a big thing, I mean, I killed that to death, right? So at the end of the lesson, he was giving exit tickets. And then I had somebody ask me, what do you do with them? And I said, I don't know, I collect them. The kids know I collect them. And, sometimes I have a time to look at them and sometimes I don't. Then don't give it. If you're not going to do something with it the next day, don't give it. And I was just like, man, I really had to kind of rethink that whole plan of they had to be more purposeful. And then I started to think of, are there other ways that I can capture learning and give them feedback? Because I wanted to give them feedback. And sometimes I wasn't always able to give them feedback at the end of the lesson. Because like you, I was talking, the bell came. And so I had to sort of plan those things. And I started to then what if I have the students create a question, and we had a pop bag where they created a question and then they would be picking their question. So sometimes they're looking to see, would my question be picked? And they can have a mini discussion at the end of class. So again, just there's so many different techniques that we can use, but again, the purpose is key. Is it at the beginning of the lesson when you're trying to prime, or is it a technique during the lesson? Like a lot of signaling, I think, especially in the younger grades, they use a lot of signaling, the 3, 2, 1, or the cups, the red and green cards, signaling techniques to kind of see, okay, tell me where you are, to monitor where kids are. But I think as teachers, you kind of have to mix it up a little bit and see, depending on the kids, the age of the kids, just sort of mix up different techniques, because again, the formative assessment as a noun is just as important as formative assessment as a verb, right? The process.
And Mellisa, as you mentioned, being intentional, when it comes to assessment, not we're saying that, it's like a hit and miss. You give a little here, you give a little there. No, the assessment for learning as teachers, we are and we should be intentional about the kinds of formative assessment or assessment for learning that we're giving our students. And it kind of take me back into my early days of writing my lesson plan. Your lesson plan has different parts to it, like, that introductory piece where you get your students all warmed up. And then there is this teacher teaching piece where students are just taking information from you. Then there's that guided practice piece where you and the students, you are collaborating and talking and you're going back and forth. And then there's that independent piece where students go and work on something. Now, this is the intentional piece of it. I now need to see what you know. And so for me, at the elementary level, I think more so, I never really relied on like exit ticket. It was always something where I planned what I wanted to see. Right. But you mentioned something here, Mellisa. You said about the different parts of all of this that I've just mentioned. We are supposed to be assessing along the way of all parts, at that introductory piece. I'm supposed to assess. I need to see what you know, and am I really zooming in on that? Because I might introduce something to you, but did I really focus to see, do you know this already? Or am I just knowing that this is my lesson, I have to get it through doing it? You understand? Or even when it comes to the teaching piece of it, was I observing what you were doing at that introductory piece to know if you already know this? And I mean, as teachers, all of us can relate to there are times when our best behaved students seemingly, like zoom us out. They're not really paying attention. And the thing is, did we really check to see what they already know? Right? So that assessment for learning, I think it should happen right throughout the entire, that teaching piece that you're doing. You're checking in just on every aspect of that lesson.
Yeah, I love that string of questions that you are kind of modeling a teacher to be asking themselves. And that goes back to Mellisa said, what is the purpose? Sometimes I fear that we use formative assessment, just the idea of it as like a panacea that like, oh, you're supposed to have formative assessment. But if you don't ask those questions, if you don't think back to what the purpose is, if you don't use it to drive instruction, then it doesn't change anything. Like there's this article by Educational Leadership, Balanced Assessment, that says extensive research on assessment and learning shows that skilled use of formative assessment has a significant positive effect on student learning. But for a formative assessment system to be effective, teachers must continually check students' learning and be willing to modify instruction to meet the students' needs identified by the data. And it's that action piece that I think is key for these techniques, for that formative assessment as a noun.
Spencer, I think what you just said kind of really zoomed in on what I was saying here, the monitoring as you're going along when you're thinking of assessment for learning.
And again, that action piece, like it has to be either the teacher doing something different or the student doing something different, right? Those are two. For it to be effective, you have to kind of take advantage of those 2 points. As we start to come to the end of this series, when we're looking at types, there is a question, again, when you kind of have this dichotomy of and for, you kind of sort of think is one better than the other. And that's why we started off with the introduction about there's a balance. And so what do you think would happen if a school only relied or a teacher only relied on assessments of learning?
So, the assessment of learning, like I said, we're thinking of it like more so at the end. Now, if we're only relying on that, we will at some point miss where our students are in their learning. It is going to become like a surprise to us, like, oh my world, I have been teaching this all along. Are you telling me that you weren't getting this? So if we were only relying on assessment of learning, we will be in for a big surprise. We would basically fail ourselves. We can't wait until the end.
Right. And I think that would perhaps expose a lot of my biases as a teacher. That the kids with whom I connect with better or have come from a shared background or something like that, I'm probably going to be more in tune with what they need. But for other kids, without having that data, I might be doing them a huge disservice. And then when the summative assessment comes around, the assessment of learning, there's going to be some kids that I failed because I didn't check in to see what they knew.
Right. So then what do you think would happen if we only did assessments for learning? If we only relied on formative assessments?
So here again, I'm thinking of, I'm going back to, our users, right? So relying on assessment for learning. As Mellisa, you mentioned before that, that tipping of the scale when it comes to the for learning, it's more so the teachers really wanting this information. And so if we're relying only on formative, then we miss some of our users, like a curriculum specialist or, the accountability piece at the state level or at the district level. Some users won't necessarily get that information that they need to, plan for, future changing of the curriculum or, keeping things the same.
Yeah, and I think there'd be a lack of closure, and it would be really tough to kind of gauge how did this work once we're kind of through it. Either for students, what standards did they learn or not, for program, for curricula, and the only way to try to counter that would be to really just kind of drown in data, just all that formative assessment data, which can at times be a little apples to orange-ish. I think that would be really tough for us as educators and tough for parents and community members to figure out, wait, what worked and what didn't? Did people get what they're supposed to? Should they move on to the next step?
Right. I like that whole thing about the lack of closure. Like you can't always just be in practice mode. At some point, you got to stop and demonstrate. And I know people like to say with formative assessments, you never grade formative assessments, right? But grades do have a point, right? You do need that formal grade at some point. You have to demonstrate at some point. You have to have the grand finale. You have to have the final destination. We can't always just be in practice mode. At some point, you got to be, all right, let's go for it and just jump all in. So I like that neither of those things work on their own. Again, it has to be a balance, right? So as we wrap up this series, I want to again thank you guys for your attention. Please be reminded if you have any questions, concerns, don't forget to reach us at www.wcpss.net/datalit. And we look forward to starting our next series. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.